thank you to the organizers for having me here. I'm very excited to talk about some studies that we've been working on for 2030 and starting to think about issues for planning for 2030. And I'm going to bring a couple different perspectives, and they might seem a little bit detached from one another, but I think sentiments in the last session kind of summed it up in that it's good to have a lot of different scenarios, and sometimes they may be wrong and looking to the future, but ultimately many different perspectives will make the answers more robust. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background about some of the questions that we think about when looking at power system planning and high resolution modeling and how that's changing now with high levels of renewables. I'll get into a project that we did under the Energy Transitions Commission, looking at 2030 operations, and that's really looking at kind of existing plans, and at this point it actually might seem a little bit obsolete given some things that have happened in the country in the last even few months about planning for 2030, but I still think there's some important lessons there. And then I'm going to get into the way we're thinking about capacity expansion, and we've been thinking around this issue for a long time and partnered and collaborated with CEA on some ideas, and now working in the states and thinking about capacity expansion planning for 2030. And I'll give a little bit of detail on some of the modeling that we're doing, and even beyond 2030, thinking about timeframes out to 2047 and what we can learn from models now, thinking out that far. So first on modeling and some of the questions that we're thinking about when we try to build a model to answer very specific questions. We're kind of breaking that up into 3 different resolutions. One being temporal or time resolutions, and thinking about the different time frames of the grid and what's important when you're thinking about potential issues with renewable energy integration. And there's a lot of talk about flexibility, and I think flexibility can span decades and go all the way down to real-time markets. And there's a lot of challenges with modeling all of these different changes in time and across these time frames. And it's important to understand the questions you're trying to answer to understand how much detail you need to put into a model from a temporal resolution. From a spatial resolution, this is a question that's becoming more and more important as renewables are growing on the grid. At one point in time, when you're thinking about system planning, it might have been easy to think about conventional generation, hooking up to transmission, and all of these pieces working together and not having to think about geography and weather and how space might matter in this. But as renewable energy grows on the system, adding spatial resolution to models can be really, really important, especially capturing the differences in weather around the country or the region. System resolution is linked to both of these, and certainly to spatial resolution as well, and thinking about how do we think about some of the constraints on the system when we're putting generators that need to be in specific places. And so the system becomes more and more important as you're constrained with location-dependent resources. So now I'd like to show what we did looking at 2030 operations. And so this was a project that we undertook, and it was really growing out of a study that was mentioned before about 2022, looking at 175 gigawatt targets. Out of that came a really sophisticated operations model. And so it was only natural for us to take that to the next step and look farther down the road to 2030 and try and answer some of the operational challenges that we might see in the 2030 timeframe. And so I guess it was about a year ago when we undertook some of this work. Some of the best existing data about what was going to be on the system in 2030 was India's National Electricity Plan from Central Electricity Authority. And so we built a model based around this, and people that know the Indian system know that this is an evolving area, and even in the last couple of months there's been some new plans from CEA about some very high levels of renewables by 2030. But we still think there's some interesting insights into looking at a plan that's a little bit outdated as far as the renewable energy ambitions of the country. So some of the features of this model, so this is an operations level model, and so we're trying to model down to essentially operational level timeframes, which we considered hourly and to be enough looking out to 2030. And so we took a lot of time to model all the individual generation of the system, individual transmission connections between states, looking at demand using the 19th Electric Power Survey, which is essentially sets the bar for demand forecasts in the country. We also worked with Terry on this project, and they're doing some demand forecasting work, trying to build bottom-up models to understand what are the drivers of demand, how are those going to change in the future, and so they also gave us some insights about how we could change our demand profiles for the future. Wind and solar is something that we take pretty seriously about trying to capture in a very accurate way, and we used the resource data that was created out of Greening the Grid, and so that's fairly high resolution data, wind down to 3 by 3 kilometer and solar down to 10 by 10 kilometer, to understand the interactions around the country about how wind and solar might change on an hourly basis. And we also modeled operational reserves from just, simple circ requirements from a regional perspective. And so from the installed capacity out of the National Electricity Plan, we get almost 700 gigawatts of installed capacity, 184 gigawatts of solar, 113 of wind. The distribution around the regions is similar to what we saw in 2022 timeframes. There's a little bit of difference in that a lot of the generation, wind and solar generation, is expected to go in the western and southern and some in the northern regions 2022. Once we start to broaden out to 2030 and grow and more wind and solar, we started to see diversity in where the wind and solar went, and we actually saw a lot of solar go in the eastern region, and there's some interesting impacts that we saw from having that diversity. And here in the map is just looking at the coal capacity that was planned through 2030. I think if you ask a lot of people in India, there are some questions about whether some of this will end up getting built by 2030, but certainly that was in what was the existing plans, and so we went ahead and built it and tried to understand if this was to be built, how would the rest of the system react. And so this probably looks a little bit like what you would see in a 2022 slide if you ever were seeing any reports on the Greening the Grid. So 22% of demand was served by wind and solar. Coal is still generating most of the energy for the country. Wind and solar was, as I said, dispersed a little more than in the 2022 timeframe. The eastern region seeing a lot of solar penetration, 20% solar penetration. But the southern region is really still producing a lot of the renewable energy generation for the country with 37% penetration in 2030. We also saw a little bit of curtailment, 2.5% of curtailment, mostly focused in a few states in the southern region, a little bit in the western as well. One difference that we saw from looking at 2022 is actually the coal plant load factors. So certainly a concern thinking about 2022 with what might be considered excess generation and low coal plant load factors. When we go out to 2030, the new coal growth didn't exactly match with the demand growth, which was quite high, and we actually saw higher coal plant load factors, potentially good news for revenue sufficiency in this time frame. So just one note of good news for coal for today, I guess. But ultimately what we saw was operationally similar to 2022. As I said, 22% of RE penetration, not too much curtailment. The flows around the country were, from a net perspective, more or less the same of what we see in the 2022 timeframe. So some of these magnitudes changed a little bit, and as we saw Mr. Narasimhan talk about the southern region becoming an exporter, we did see the southern region almost tip over into an exporter for 2030. in this scenario, but not quite, still a net importer. So overall, things looked okay. Pretty normal operation. The system was able to balance. But we did have some periods of unserved energy. And these ended up being sort of interesting for a couple reasons. So here's a scenario in September during the highest demand week where we saw unserved energy. And when we took away some of the details of our model to try and understand why this happened. So we took out transmission. So what you're seeing here is actually a copper plate scenario. So we essentially assumed that energy can flow where it needs to without transmission to try and uncover why this would be happening with unserved energy. And we still saw it. And ultimately, what we found was that it was mostly to unfortunate timing in the peak loads of the states and the peak load of the country. And so India's peak, in this case, happened at the end of September, and a lot of the bigger states in the country's peak happened a couple weeks later. As you can see, Maharashtra a couple weeks after India's peak. And this led to outage scheduling within our model that led to some low capacity during India's total peak. And so this might not be reality from an outage scheduling perspective, but we thought this brought some new insights about a more capacity constrained scenario than you might see in 2022, where coordination among states is certainly important and is something that everybody talks about from renewable energy integration, but as you come to more capacity constrained areas, it could mean a lot for reliability as well. So I'm going to move on to some work we've been doing on actually optimizing the generation and transmission planning for 2030. And so we've done this in kind of a loose collaboration with CEA and trying to build a model of India where we can understand what the optimal mix will be for 2030 instead of just using what was existing plans from the National Electricity Plan. And we've certainly got a lot of input from different stakeholders around the country, as well as working within the states to understand how we can better build our models to not necessarily predict what will happen, but to help build scenarios that can help us build robust systems for the future. And so we used a model called the Regional Energy Deployment System, and this is a model that NREL has been using for many years in the US. There was actually a picture of it this morning, and some of the work we've done with North America and trying to plan for high levels of renewables. Ultimately, it's a capacity expansion model that is very good at spatial resolution and getting a lot of wind and solar information into that model to help plan for highly variable systems. And so capacity expansion models ultimately built to find the mix of generation and transmission that could help meet the anticipated requirements. So essentially deciding what to build, where to build it, and when. And so at NREL, we had used this in the US for many, many years, and we built an India version in collaboration with CEA. And so some of the spatial characteristics that we have thought would be important, particularly in the wind and solar, and capturing that at a high resolution, looking at land availability and resource quality to understand what is the total potential up there, what is the cost of building transmission to those high resource areas, and also take into account that there could be curtailment of RE, and capacity credit of RE can change as more renewable energy is put on the system. So it's important to understand what renewable energy can contribute from a reliability perspective. Another kind of spatial characteristic that we put in is different costs of coal around the country, as well as transmission and trying to capture why it might be hard to build transmission in certain parts of the country. From a temporal perspective, what I talked about earlier, an operational model hourly for a whole year, that's difficult to do when you're looking out and trying to model every single year and optimize around the generation and the transmission and understanding all the different characteristics. So when we run READS, we actually run a reduced form dispatch looking at only certain time slices. And what each one of these boxes represents is a representative time slice for that time of the year. And so these are all of the time slices we use for India, and we've worked with stakeholders here to try and make sure we're capturing different changes on the system, what are going to be some key times of the day and the year that will impact what needs to be built from a reliability perspective. So I'm going to present just a few results on the base case, and I think I actually should be speeding up here. I promised I would go fast. So I'll present just a couple slides on what we consider our base case, so using the best approximations for costs and policies that we could come up with our stakeholder interactions, and then talk about a couple scenarios really quickly. So here's results from our base case out to 2047. And what we see is no surprise, wind and solar are dominating the growth of capacity in the country. We also are looking at batteries, so battery energy storage systems in the top. And we see that in around the mid-20s, we start to see some battery growth in the country to increase the flexibility and be able to handle the variability from wind and solar. So just slicing out 2030 here, what we saw in 2030 was 306 gigawatts of wind and solar, and also 28 gigawatts of batteries, which seems like a lot. But ultimately what we saw was a linkage between solar and battery growth, and a lot of the batteries going in the northern and southern regions where we saw a lot of solar growth. And here's a look at our simplified dispatch. So on the top is the generation throughout the model in the different times of the year. And we see coal still dominates for the most part, but we did see 47% of RE generation in this 2030 year. And so what you see there with the demand is actually the black dot within the generation. And so you can see that during the middle of the day, the black dot is below the actual generation line. So what's happening there is the battery is charging, and later in the evening, sure the colors are coming through, but later in the evening, you'll see the battery discharging during peak times in the evening and peak periods. On the bottom graph, I'm just showing the operating reserves and what was provisioned. And we're still seeing mostly coal and gas being provisioned for operating reserves, hydro during some key times. And on the top there is also batteries, which you might be able to just see a sliver of, also holding some of the operating reserve provision. So beyond the base scenario, we wanted to look at kind of two obvious interesting scenarios looking at changes in technology costs. So we did a low solar scenario where we declined solar PV costs at a faster rate than the base scenario, and a low battery cost where we also declined cost at a faster rate than the base scenario. To understand how the changes in technology, some of these unknowns might be impacting the growth of the system. And these graphs are just showing the installed capacity out to 2030. And what we see is that in the low battery scenario, we actually saw more solar PV growth than in the low solar scenario. So there's a close linkage between solars and batteries and how they can work together to encourage solar and the flexibilization through batteries. So in conclusion, coordination of the states, I know this is something that people in RE integration say a lot. Coordination across state boundaries in India could have a really large impact on the success of RE integration. And what we showed in greening the grid for 2022 is costs. It will really help with cost of running the system, but looking out to 2030, it could also really help with reliability. And batteries will likely play a role by 2030. I think there are a lot of questions about the price of batteries. What we used was a fairly conservative estimate by essentially the standard Bloomberg Energy, New Energy Finance, and we still saw growth start to happen in the mid to late 20s. And that's just in the base case scenario. And the growth of solar may be linked to batteries more than it is to the cost of solar PV in the future. And something just to reiterate, that scenario modeling, certainly we're going to get things wrong, but having many different scenarios helps to ensure a robust system, and having stakeholders driving a lot of these scenarios is a very important part of doing all of this modeling. So thank you. The model that we developed to do the capacity expansion will be open source this year. So for all the researchers out there, we'd be happy to talk to you later.